Right. And what else did we discuss? What about some philosophical ideas that influences Kabir?
So the Bhakti movement.
So what about that?
So it was, we talked about what Bhakti is, and uh, we discussed that it's an intense, passionate devotion for the divine, and often the erotic and spiritual went hand in hand in the in the Indian Bhakti movement, and
Right.
the relationship between Krishna and Radha is also seen as and yeah, we talked about allegory. So the relationship between Krishna and Radha is also an allegory, as a love story, not just between two individuals of an erotic kind, but more than that, it's a relationship between the divine and the human, where Krishna would be the divine, and Radha represents the human.
Right. Uh,
And then how the Bhakti movement began in the south in Tamil Nadu, and it came to the north, and the person uh, who uh, who brought the Bhakti movement to the north, I think, was Shankaracharya, right?
no, it was Ramanand.
Ramanand. Okay, yes. Ramanand. And yeah, we also talked about Shankaracharya, how he defeated how he re-established Brahminism in the 8th and 9th century in South India.
Right.
And he was a stout believer in the Advait philosophy, that is non-duality.
Exactly. And what do you mean by duality?
So non-duality would mean that that the self and the ultimate reality, that is the Brahma. Uh, so there's no such thing. There's no that they're not separate, and you are God and God is you. Aisa. And then
Right.
we also talked about the Sufism, and how that is different from non-duality, because they don't believe in the they believe in the oneness, but not that we humans are God. There is a very um, marked distinction between God and us. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And in Sufism, there is also this trope of eroticism and love that seems to be similar, but not exactly the same as the trope of eroticism in non-Sufi or Hindu traditions, right? And one of the most important poems that celebrates this erotic spiritual love between Radha and Krishna is Jaydev's Geet Govindam, right? A Sanskrit poem, and where Radha becomes a central figure compared to her earlier versions in Vedic or Mahabharata. So she is the most important character of Geet Govind, uh, but she is not so important in Srimad Bhagavat, where she is probably just mentioned, but as one of the shepherd girls. But she becomes very important after Jayadev's Geet Govind. And Srimad Bhagavat is a Puran, which is also very important uh, uh, text for uh, bhakti, Vaishnava bhakti, right? Vaishnava implies devotion to Vishnu, and there are various sampradayas to Vaishnavism, right? Vaishnavism is where you consider Vishnu as your central Ishta Devata. Ishta Devata means your primary god of worship, which is your favorite. Shaivism implies that Shiva is your most important deity. You understand Brahma, that is ultimate reality, as Shiva or Vishnu, as Ansh or avatar of these Brahma, right? Human manifestations of this ultimate reality. And there were numerous sampradayas around. By sampradaya, you mean sects, but not sects as we understand them in Christianity. In Christianity, sects mean that you are falling out from one central church. For example, if there is Roman Catholicism as your main church, then during Reformation, Protestants were several sects that fell out or fell away from that central church. But in Hinduism, there is no such central church. So you cannot really understand these sampradayas as sects. But we don't have equivalents, like we don't have equivalents for many things. So we use word sects to describe various sampradayas around Vishnu. Most famous ones are sampradayas of Pushti Marg by Vallabhacharya. Another very important sampradaya is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's sampradaya, right? Based in Bengal but spread all over, Chaitanya sampradaya. And then you also have Swaminarayan as a very important sampradaya of Vaishnava. In Marathi, you have Maharashtra, you have Varkari sampradaya as a major Vaishnava sampradaya. And you also have Mahanubhava sampradaya in Maharashtra. In South, you have Namarwars as important Vaishnava sampradaya. So you can see that these sampradayas or the organizations, you can say, are spread all over the subcontinent. Similarly, you have Shaiva sampradayas of all kinds. So what we are doing from yesterday is we are trying to understand the historical background to Kabir at certain length, something that you didn't when you studied Dohas of Kabir in your school. Right? You studied Dohas of Kabir, right? In the school? Yes, no?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
And while studying English literature, we study history of English literature, right? You have papers. My audio is not clear? Or is there a problem with my audio?
No, sir, you're
No,
audible.
sir.
Jay cannot hear me clearly, it seems. Others can?
Oh, yes, sir. I can hear you.
So, coming back to one of the points that we do is we study history of English literature at length, right? You have papers of history of English literature. You studied that from Renaissance, from Chaucer. Then you have Restoration, and you have Neoclassicism and Romanticism and all that. Yes or no? You are studying history of English literature when you study English literary texts. Similarly, when we study Indian literature, we have to understand history of Indian literature, right, at certain length. So, and why do we do that? Is because you come to college to not study literature, but how to study literature. And there are two important ways about how to study literature, right? One is you attend to the form, critical appreciation part that you did in your first year paper, if you remember, your stylistic analysis, close reading of texts. And the second is the contextual reading of literature. You have to understand literary text in its historical context. Basically, there are two ways, and very often, though they merge, they are also divergent, and that's the problem that we have to face all the time. when we study Indian all literatures. So one of the problems that we face while studying Indian literature, a basic problem that I think no one else has been able to solve, is lack of historical contexts, because uh, Indian understandings of history before the British came were very different from the Eurocentric or Western modern understanding of history. Right, so Itihasa and Purana traditions were understood as history, but they are not history in the way you understand history of English literature, right? Hence, we are never clear about when was Mahabharata exactly composed, or Ramayana exactly composed, or when was Kabir, or how many Kalidasas are there, right? And a very often large section of Indian literature is in the form of orally transmitted literature. There are very few manuscripts which were written by the poets themselves, which makes it extremely difficult for us to historically contextualize literature. That is one of the fundamental problems of studying Indian literature, that there are too many texts and too little contexts, right? And it is a difficulty that we have to face throughout our lives. We have to grapple, right? It's not just for the students of BA, but even till the end of your life, if you are studying Indian literature like me, then we'll be grappling with that problem. So when we come to Kabir, we look at certain important backgrounds to Kabir. Right? We looked at what is the idea of Advait, how did Bhakti began in the south and spread. We also looked at Bhagavad Gita, we looked at Bhagavad, we looked very quickly at Shankaracharya, right? And couple of more important things that we have to bear in mind before we start reading Kabir. And what I have done is I have given you the texts in the group. So what you can do is you can open these texts, right, whenever we start reading, and we will read it both in English and in Hindi. Right, I have kept both the text, and I will only tell you the page number where we have to go. But before we actually start reading the text, let's look at some more important background knowledge that we should have before we study Kabir. Right? As we have been discussing, after the collapse of Gupta Empire, which was considered as golden age because it was the age of great developments in art and literature, especially in Kalidas, and even the
So your voice is breaking.
Mudra Rakshas is a product. I wonder why. What might be the reason for that? What might be the reason that my voice is breaking?
So the bandwidth of the network must be getting low sometimes.
Right. Also, maybe Teams is not so. It's get heavily loaded probably. Teams is not the first choice. But anyway, if you think that my voice is breaking too much, then we may go over to Google Meet and try. Right? What else can we do?
So are there any other applications open?
Except for WhatsApp that I have opened in my Chrome. And I think Chrome is also one of the things that is very heavy. Yeah. And
Yes,
other
it takes up a lot of RAM.
Yeah, and PDF that I have opened for this. So maybe I will sign out of WhatsApp and Chrome. That will maybe.
Yes, so just close the Chrome window and then try. It will be a bit better.
I think we should look for other browser options, lighter versions of something. And given my laptop is not the latest version, it's very old compared to the one that the PC that I have in office. Let's see.
Yes, sir. The main part is the random access memory, and if the applications are heavy, it gets filled.
So I have closed the Chrome, and Chrome is too heavy. It's a very it's a heavy app. So is my audio better now?
Yes, sir. It's pretty smooth.
Okay, right. So we are looking at some more important background knowledge that we should have before we approach Kabir in a more serious way than we did in your school, right? Apart from the idea of Advait and Bhakti, and we look at the period after the collapse of Gupta Empire, and Gupta Empire was also one of very important uh, cultural developments which codified uh, Varna system very rigidly. So Varna system that you find in Vedic text becomes extremely rigid and oppressive by the time you reach Gupta period. And the evidence for this is the Manusmriti that was composed during this period. And if you look at the whole idea of authorship, means Manu is a mythological divine figure, right? First human being probably. Shastra, Bharat is a semi-divine Rishi. Valmiki is Rama, and Valmiki Rishi is almost divine figure. So authorship in India seems to operate very differently from the idea of author in the West. Shakespeare is not a divine figure, right? Though people adore him, it's not. Nobody associates Shakespeare with miracles or supernatural powers. So idea of authorship is also very different. That, and you have to keep in mind these differences. Yeah, Bhavya, go ahead. You have a
So
question.
even if we look at the classical texts in the Western literature, like Beowulf, even though it's such a divine tale of a very amazing hero going on these conquests, to this day they do not consider him as a part of their mythology or their belief system. Even though at perhaps one point of time that might have been the case.
Yeah, that's true. So, even in classical Western literature, you are right that there were certain kind of supernatural powers associated with the authors. But even then, nobody considers Virgil to have a supernatural power, or Homer himself to have some supernatural powers, right? Like you have for the Vedic texts or for Mahabharata and Ramayana, right? So, though classical texts in the West do have certain similarities, the idea of authorship seems to be pretty different when it comes to India. Uh, After Gupta period, there are several dynasties that crop up before the advent of Central Asian Turkic or Turkish, Persian, Afghans, Arabs, often lumped together as Muslims or Islamic rulers, right? Even before these rulers, before these dynasties came up, there is a whole set of dynasties like Rashtrakutas, like Chalukyas of Badami, Chalukyas of Gujarat, or Solankis, right? You have Pallava, Pandya, and Cholas in the south. You have several dynasties that crop up all over the place in India. And all these kings and all these kingdoms uh, play an important role in transformation of religious ethos in India. And you see a growth of something called Tantra, right? And I don't know if you've heard of this term before. Tantra as a kind of religious phenomena on Indian subcontinent. And I prefer to use the word Indic rather than Indian, right? So Indic religiosity. There is a development called Tantra. And I don't know how many of you are aware of Tantra. Is anyone aware of Tantra? Yeah, Dharma, bolo. Who is aware of the? Has anyone heard of Tantra? It has something to do with supernatural activities. Yes. What else?
Occult practices.
Occult practices. Very good. And what do you mean by occult?
Dark magic in a way.
Not exactly. Dark magic is a part of occultism, right? Occultism means you are relying on certain supernatural powers. In Indian context, it was called siddhis, right? And Hanumanji was considered to have Ashtasiddhi, right? So Ashtasiddhi are 8 kinds of superpowers that you accomplish, right, through austerities and penances. And those austerities and penances were called, what should I say, sadhana, right? So sadhana would result in siddhis or accomplishments as forms of superpowers. But Tantra as a religious phenomena implies development of certain different paradigm of religion. And what do we mean when I say different paradigm of Hinduism? Is that Hinduism in the Vedic period, if you look at it, then it is centered on Ved, right? And the Vedic pantheon of gods include Indra and Varun and Agni as the major gods. Marut, Ashwini Kumars. So these are various gods of Vedic pantheon. Then later on you find Puranic pantheon emerging in a big way. And in Puranic pantheon you see Vaishnavism, Vishnu, Shiv as 2 very important deities, and the third one is Shakti or Devi, goddess. So that is the another transformation of Hinduism that happens somewhere around 2nd century roughly before Christ. And then we find yet another transformation happening, and that is called Tantra. And what is Tantra? Then Tantra is a set of texts, right? And the practices which are authorized by those texts. So what if somebody asks you what is Tantra, then Tantra is those texts which call themselves as Tantra, right? These are set of books which prescribe certain rituals and practices, right? And the person who practices these is called the Tantric, right? And these practices involve initiation or Diksha. And what happens here is the idea of Guru becomes central to Tantra, right? The idea of Guru or Acharya in Mahabharata or Ramayana is very different. For example, in Mahabharata, Guru is Dronacharya, and he teaches the princes the art of war, martial arts, as well as how to rule over things and Vedic texts and all that. The Acharya. You find similar things with in Ramayana, right? Valmiki is a guru. In Bhagavad you find Acharya as Sandipani, who who is the guru of Krishna. But these gurus are more of teachers, mentors. But in tantric tradition, guru is almost more important than God, almost, right? And that is something that is very different from earlier forms of religiosity in India. And that's why a very famous doha of Kabir, I don't know if you have heard of it, is Guru Gobind Do Khade, Kako Lagu Pai. Balihari Gurudev ki Govind Diyo Bataye. Right. So Kabir says that Guru and Gobind are both in front of me. Whose feet should I touch first? Then he says that I will first touch the feet of my Guru because he has shown me how to reach Govind or God. So Guru becomes a kind of central religious figure in Tantra because he is the person who gives initiation or diksha, very often in form of mantra, Guru mantra, right? And mantra would not be the same mantra as the Vedic mantras, right? Vedic mantras are collected in the four samhitas: Rig Veda, Atharva Veda, Samaveda, and Yajurveda. These mantras that the gurus gave were very different, right? They were not the mantras of the Vedic mantras. So a guru would initiate the disciple into certain esoteric religious practices. By esoteric, you mean something which is secret to that sampradaya or a sect or that school. So esoteric practices of around the guru would initiate people, right? So initiation or diksha, guru and mantra becomes very important aspect of tantric religiosity, if you can say so. And in this, it was completely open for all the castes, right? That is another major shift that has happened in Hinduism, that in Tantra, people from lower caste can also become gurus, right? It's a paradigm shift almost. In Mahabharata, Ramayana, you find that Acharya or Guru can only Brahmins be the Acharyas or Gurus, right? And here you find anyone can become Guru, given that person has this power and authority, which is very often power of occultism, right? These people use the text called tantras, right? And Shaiva Siddhant, and there were many Shaiva tantras called Agama, and lot of Vaishnava tantras called Pancharatra. Pancharatra was the set of texts around Krishna. So Agama, Pancharatra, and it also went into Buddhism in a major way. Buddhism was transformed by Tantra, so that you find something called Vajrayana Buddhism emerging, and Vajrayana Buddhism is a Tantric Buddhism, right? And it again focuses on occultism, esoteric practices, Guru mantra, and all that, right? And it has got a whole set of rituals that I'm not going into. So Buddhism and Hinduism and slowly start resembling each other. That is also a very important thing, that Buddhism died out not just because of persecution by certain kings and Brahmins, but because it started resembling Hinduism substantially. Means they would have goddesses of all kinds, and goddess becomes one of very important powers in tantric schools of various kinds. Tantra was not a single school, but a whole range of schools with a range of texts that describe themselves as Tantra, right? uh, Kaula Tantra and whatnot. So Tantra is a major development that we have to bear in mind. In this Tantra, goddess or Shakti becomes extremely important. Goddess is almost as important or even more important than God in tantric schools, right? So you have, say for example, Kali as a huge religious figure in Bengal, right? That owns a lot to Tantrism in Bengal. And in Bengal, you also had Buddhist Tantrism in a major way. Uh, uh, Buddhist tantrics in Bengal wrote poems in vernacular, but they used cryptic, uh, seemingly irrational imagery, written like poems, right? And it was written in a vernacular called Sandhya Bhasha or Sandhya Bhasha, and it consisted of kinds of poems which does not make any sense, right? They are all upside down, and we are discussing this because Kabir himself composed what is known as Ulat Basi. Ulat Basi. Ulat Basi is upside down, topsy turvy language. It would say that how deer ate lion, or how did water drink the human being, and so on and so forth, right? I will read that, we will get a sense of what is Ulat Basi. So all these upside down, topsy turvy languages and idioms became very important part of Bengali Tantra, and later on it entered the other parts of India as well. You find similar compositions which are uh, irrational, illogical, but they consist spiritual messages which a knowledgeable person can understand, right? So it is something like koans in Zen. I am not sure if you have heard of Zen. How many of you have heard of Zen? Yes, Bhavya, Stuti. What do you know about Zen, Stuti?
I know very little, but from what I have understood so far, it means something along the lines of inner peace, uh, something like that. So,
Actually means dhyan, right? It is the Sanskrit word dhyana, which became Zen in Japanese. So Buddhism traveled all over the world, China and Tibet and Indonesia and Japan, and they developed their own systems of religious practices. So Zen is one of such Japanese meditative practices in Buddhism in Japan and China and all that. Uh, and the masters of Zen would use something like koans, K-O-A-Ns. That is the mysterious speech, which or do something very mysterious that would awaken the disciple, right? So the whole metaphor of awakening the disciple is a very important part of tantric practices. And Vajrayana Buddhism is an important tantric development. Now what happens that there are also several sadhus who don't really follow many of these tantras, but they are adepts, they are siddhas, right? So there is another religious phenomena called siddha traditions, right? These siddhas are sadhus with supernatural powers, occult powers, power to be invisible, power to be communicate without talking to other, power to become very, very small, power to go out of one's body, right? These are the superpowers. Uh, Power to understand future and past, power to curse people, and so on and so forth, right? So these occult powers became very important, and one of the most primary aspects of Hinduism till date was moksha, right? The fourth purpose of life, which started slowly becoming subsidiary to all these magical occult ritual powers. One another development in Tantra was something called left-handed way or Vampanth, right? Not to be confused with the political left today, right? We are not talking of modern political ideology of left. Vampanth was that those schools of Tantra which would do everything that was prohibited in mainstream religion, like alcohol, drugs, like sex, orgies of all kinds, uh, taking skulls, right, and moving around with skulls, or doing sadhana or austerities in cremation ground. Uh, you might have heard of Naga Bawas or the naked sadhus, right? And you might have also heard of those aghoris, as they were called, right? Dharma. You're absolutely right. Aghoris who did these kind of practices in cremation ground. Vam Marga, right? Left-handed way of Tantra would have kind of sexual practices, right? Uh, they would use alcohol, drugs, they would sit on corpse and do certain kind of practices and all that. And the central system for all this was something called Kundalini. Kundalini is the immanent Shakti or power, goddess, that resides in all world, entire world, right? God and his power resides in everything, including human body. So human body became a kind of microcosm for the whole universe. So just like goddess pervades the entire universe, goddess also pervades human body. And not physical body, but subtle bodies, that is the sukshma dehas, right? She is not seen, and she lives in the form of the serpent, right, in one of the chakras or one of the centers in your sukshma deha. And you might have heard of all these. Is anyone familiar with all this? Kundalini Shakti? How many of you are familiar with this system? Yeah, Dia. What do you know of that? Bolo.
Sir, I have heard that, like you said, it's like a serpent shape that
Yeah,
encircles the base of our spine, and
right.
by some tantric activities we can activate it or something like that.
And that power is to be raised, taken to your head, which is the center called Sahasrahara or chakra with 1,000 petals. Now you may ask me that why are we discussing all these things? Because Kabir used all these metaphors throughout, and Bhakti poetry is rich with this Kundalini metaphors, right? And this power goes to the last chakra, that is lotus with 1,000 petals on your head. She has to be raised through various chakras, right? And it is raised through two channels that connect your base of your spine, that is called Mooladhar, that is the root support, right? Mooladhara and the Sahasrara. And there are two channels called Sushumna and Ida, Pingla and Sushumna. So Ida is one channel, Sushumna is another channel, and Pingla is third channel. Sushumna balances both, and Kundalini is taken to the highest point. And to raise that, you use all kind of esoteric practices, uh, and with each chakra that it entered, it gave you certain superpowers. So basically, you do all these things to achieve superpowers, and by the time it reaches your head chakra, then it results in self-realization of Advait that we are talking about. So basically, you can see this system of self-realization through certain rituals which are non-Vedic, mantras which are non-Vedic, practices which are non-Vedic, right? Open to all people irrespective of caste and gender. Doing things that are forbidden in mainstream dharma shastras, right? Like having sex with untouchable women. So they did everything. And kings were very fond of this because and they patronized all these things, and there arose certain discontent with all this tantra siddha business, right? And people wanted to reform this. Yeah, under which path of yoga does this fall? Now that is a complicated question because yoga has several kinds of, and what is relation between tantra and yoga is another very complicated question, right? Patanjali's Yoga Sutra also talks about the similar things, right? So Hatha Yoga was seen to be one of the practices where you do rigorous austerities and give time to your body in all sorts of ways, so that you get these powers and you become divine, right? And one of the things that happens when you become divine is you are able to access heaven, and the person in charge of heaven is Indra, who obviously does not like all these things. His monopoly is challenged. People in power don't like other people gaining powers, right? That's universal, basically. So Indra is anybody. Yeah, Diya, what are you saying? Kundalini yoga is also a kind of, yes, it is. But it gets, in tantras, it gets a different spin, right? Yoga can be part of mainstream Brahmanical practices, but tantra is a kind of thing that really breaks caste gender barriers. It breaks all the mainstream religious beliefs, right? So, the discontent, yeah, Diya, bolo.
Sir, I had heard that we were discussing the relationship between Radha and Krishna. So I had heard that Radha is a goddess in Tantra, where
Very true. She becomes a goddess because goddess becomes the most important figure in tantra, right? So certain Vaishnavite tantra like Pancharatra would see Radha as a spiritual power, right? Shakti, and obviously it involves enactments done by human beings. The the initiates of the guru would practice union of Radha and Krishna. That means those people who are given initiations by the guru would have sex with women, translating it into a very rough language, so that it resulted, according to them, in some spiritual elevation, right? So uh, one sadhak, a person who is doing sadhana, would become Krishna, and other female sadhak would become Radha, and they would have sex. So people are not very happy with all these developments in Tantra, especially Hatha yogis of various kinds. They saw this as corruption. So there emerged another movement from that called the Nath Panth, right? And the Nath tradition develops as a kind of reform within this tantric siddha traditions. These are yogis, these are siddhas, the adepts, right? Very often shaivas, most of them were shaivas, but these people wanted to reform uh, tantra, make it spiritual instead of licentious hypocrisy that was pervasive. People took it as a kind of license to have any kind of sex and any kind casual sex, and under the guise of religion. And that's why Nath tradition wanted to reform it. And some of the most important Nath figures include Gorakhnath, right? Machindranath, Gorakhnath, and others. And Gorakhnath becomes a very important figure because his influence on Kabir is tremendous. So Kabir is influenced by Nath tradition, which seeks to reform these tantric uh, uh, schools, adepts. So one of the important sharp criticism that Kabir sets out is against these fake hypocrite sadhus and Sufis and Maulvis, right? That is primary, almost Kabir is extremely, what should I say, direct in his attack on these people, right? And the language that Kabir uses is the language that very often people like Gorakhnath would use. And that language is a mixture of various dialects that existed in that time. And so people have called it Sadhukkadi, right? And this is the last point for the background of Kabir. The language which is called Hindi today is called Hindi very late, maybe 17th, 18th century, and slowly it becomes standardized because of British colonial education, because of printing press, because of books that started printing Hindi, right? So the language and British came in 19th century, became prominent in the late 18th and 19th century. So what you get is something which is not called Hindi, right? There were languages were titled Hindavi, Dakhini, Urdu, Hindustani, and so on and so forth. So Hindustani is a broader category of language, right? And this Hindustani, which is mixture of Urdu and Sanskrit and all forms of Upper Brunch and Prakrit languages, right, which existed before 10th century. So linguistic map of India before Kabir, right, would have something like Sanskrit, which is the language of religious practices, spirituality, and high elite literature like Kalidas and Vishakdat, followed by Prakrits of all kinds. Prakrits were the normal, natural, everyday registers. And the third would be upper brunch or more corrupt forms of it, right? And Kalidas plays or Shudrak's plays or Vishakdat's plays were kind of trilingual or bilingual, where the elites, upper caste, kings, queens, Vidushak, who is a Brahmin, would speak Sanskrit, while the lower caste people would use Prakrit. in the play. From these Prakruts and from these Apabransh emerges these modern Indian languages like Marathi, somewhere in 9th, 10th century, Gujarati, it was called Gurjar Bhasha, Punjabi, right, Sindhi in the Sindh region. So these are regional coordinates to these various kinds of new languages. They are called modern Indo-Aryan languages, right? So you have ancient Indo-Aryan language, which is Vedic Sanskrit or language of Zend Avesta of Parsis in Iran, and there is a kind of Proto-Ur Indo-European language which existed before that. Then from Vedic Sanskrit, you have classical Sanskrit, in which the play that we read was composed, right? And then you have Prakruts, which became literary language, and Apabransh, which also became a literary language. And some of great poems were written in Prakruts. Buddhists used Pali language, and Jains would use Apabransh and other forms of Prakrut. Then you come to modern Indo-European languages like Gujarati, Punjabi, Bengali, and something called Hindi. Hindi is a modern word, right? Hindi is, and I don't know how many of you study linguistics, because there is something called diglossia. Diglossia means one language having two forms. एक ही भाषा है मगर उसके दो मेजर फॉर्म्स हैं. So there is language called Hindustani, and it has got two major forms. One which draws substantially from Persian and Arabic, it is called Urdu, and one which draws substantially from Sanskrit is called Hindi. So Hindi and Urdu are actually forms of one language called Hindustani. And the separation between Hindi and Urdu is very, very recent, only 100 years old, 125, 30 years old. Because Premchand, and I'm sure you've heard of Premchand, right? How many of you have heard of Premchand? Premchand is one of the most important Urdu writers, right? And then he moved over to Hindi because he thought that Hindi had a greater readership, so he would earn more money by writing in Hindi. So you would have his story in Urdu as well as in Hindi. So Kafan would be in Urdu as well as in Hindi. Urdu used the Arabic script called Nastaliq, right? But its grammar and vocabulary is very similar to Hindi. So it is not a different language from Hindi. It's the same language, same grammar, but two lexes and scripts. And the British were particularly keen on dividing these because they wanted to divide India. Right? And so partition of India that happened in 1947 first happened in the language called Hindustani. It was partitioned into Urdu and Hindi. So Urdu for Muslims and Hindi for Hindus. So Hindu-Muslim divide is played out in linguistic domain by encouragement of British, because they don't want unity. No politician wants unity. So let's not blame British for it. So they divided the language into two. So you have Hindi and Urdu as modern languages. And if you watch older films, then you will see that very often the title of cinema films that you watch in so-called Hindi are also written in Nastaliq, because the language of Hindi, so-called Hindi cinema is not Hindi but Hindustani. And the older forms of Hindustani included things like Sadhukadi language, in which Kabir wrote, Awadhi and Braj, which are major literary languages. Right? Braj is associated with Krishna Bhakti. Awadhi is associated with Ram Bhakti. So Tulsi Ramayana is in some form of Awadhi language. You also had language like Maithili, and it's a very important modern Indian language. Bhojpuri. So what is called Hindi is a very problematic term. Right? It is essentially contested concept. It So Bhojpuri film industry today is one of thriving industry. Maithili is language of Nepal, national language of Nepal. Maithili is also important in Bihar, right? So what goes under by the name of Hindi is a kind of conglomerates of languages which are labeled as Hindi. And it is not very good idea because it does lot of damage to Maithili literature, which gets, or Bhojpuri literature, or Awadhi literature, or Braj literature, because all of it is considered as Hindi. So when you studied Hindi literature in your school, you are not actually studying Hindi literature, right? You started out by reading Kabir and Rahim and Ras Khan and Tulsidas. Have you studied all these people in your school? Rahim, Ras Khan, Tulsidas. How many of you studied some of their writings in school? हिंदी कितने लोगों का था 10th, 11th, 12th में? दिया, स्तुति. So Jay, what do you remember from your school Hindi poems? Did you
I remember so many dohas and those short stories by them. Dohas were like prominent part of the poetry section in Hindi. They were like first or second always, as
Right.
far as I can remember.
As by which people?
I think Kabir, Rahim, and I don't remember a few other names, but I am definitely sure about Kabir and Rahim. And I think there was one of like non-Muslim writer as well, which I am not remembering the name right now, but I am sure that there was one.
See, many Muslim poets wrote Krishna Bhakti. Right? Ras Khan is one of the most famous Krishna Bhakt. I don't know if you have heard of Ras Khan. Right? So, Rahim is another. Jayasi is a very famous Sufi poet who wrote Padmavat. So, these are some of the poets of the time. Right? And they are actually not Hindi. They are, Tulsidas, for example, uses Awadhi, a dialect of Awadhi, not even a proper Awadhi, right? Not the standard language of Awadhi. Surdas would, have you heard of Surdas?
Yes.
How many of
Yes.
great Krishna Bhakti, right? Poet who wrote in Braj, followed by Meera, another great Braj poet, whose poems are found in Rajasthani, Gujarati, Hindi, तीनों में. So, isn't that very strange? It was not because the linguistic boundaries that between Rajasthani, Gujarati, Hindi and Braj are very recent. And because lot of it is oral tradition, lot of compositions of Meera in, say, for example, Rajasthan would be using Rajasthani language because they are orally transmitted. So in Gujarat, you have Meera who is performed in Gujarati. In Braj, of course, that is the national language of Krishna Bhakti, right? Which he brought to Dwarka, and many poets in Gujarat wrote in Braj because of Krishna Bhakti that Meera influenced, right? So what you can see is that the language, that linguistic background is very complex compared to English literature, that we have to keep in mind. And Sadhukkadi is a kind of mixture of language that was spoken in Varanasi. Uh, so Kabir uses that. Uh, it cannot be classified as any one language, but a mixture of language, and it goes back to Gorakhnath, who also used Sadhukkadi language, right? And there is a language called Dakhini, which is also a form of Hindi language that is spoken on Deccan. Uh, so that's the linguistic background. Any questions about whatever we have discussed? We have discussed the philosophical background, cultural background, political background, uh, and linguistic background to Kabir. Anything that you have to say about this? A very good introduction to cultural background is this book. My favorite, right? It is a genealogy of devotion, Bhakti, Tantra, Yoga, and Sufism in North India. So Patton Burchett talks about how Bhakti emerged in North India, and how does it take from Tantra and Yoga and Sufism. Uh, what we don't very often meet is Kabir the Sufi, and I have this small collection of Kabir Bani by Ali Sardar Jafri, who is one of the leading poets, Urdu poets of India. And his discussion of Kabir emphasizes the Sufi side of Kabir. So that is something that we should also, those who are interested in all these things, right, can take. And I also use this as a kind of textbook, Kabir Granthavali by Ram Kishore Sharma. Why? Because Kabir is Shakespeare of India, or that's why. So if you are into Indian literature, he is what Shakespeare is to English literature, and they are in very different historical, cultural contexts. You have Kabir performance even in Gujarati. Ya Diya, go ahead.
Sir, I don't know if it will make sense, but I was really into reading Rumi's poems, and
Rumi.
yeah, sometimes I found them similar to these, not exactly, but kind of the theme of them all. But then I read that his poems are that which we read today are not very well translated, and sometimes some other people write their own stuff in Rumi's name. So I think,
So Jalaluddin Rumi is one of the leading Sufi poets, right? Who is extremely influential world over. And there are several translations of Rumi available, right? Uh, Kabir is also very popular world over, and you find people like Robert Bly. Many poets have translated Kabir. Most famous popular translation of Kabir is by Rabindranath Tagore, 100 poems of Kabir, right? But that is not very accurate, and it does not rely on standard texts. Linda Hess has translated the Bijak, the one that we are studying, and Bijak is the core text of Kabir Panth, right? So Kabir Sampradaya considers Bijak to be its basic text. It consists of Shabad, that is Shabda, Ramani, that is one genre, meter, which we'll talk about, and Sakhi. Sakhi is upper branch of Sakshi, that is witness, a very important theme in Kabir. Ramani is about Raman or Leela. From that it becomes Ramani. Some people also call it a form of Ramayan, Ramani hua. and sabad is shabd, because so this is the standard text and it is not entire translation, it's just selection. So we will follow some poems of that. We are not going to read much of Kabir, and we will be talking about that Kabir that you are not very familiar with through popular dohas, right? So that you can amplify your understanding of Kabir. And I have kept two books with you, and I think we have run out of time, but we'll read one poem by Kabir and we will stop. Anything that you have to say before we read?
Sir, can you put the name of that book in the chat box? The genealogy of devotion.
Genealogy
Yeah.
of Devotion. It is lucid, but it is very, very extensively researched. You can see the size, right? Pattern Burchett. And he also emphasizes the Sufi interaction of bhakti, because Sufis share this metaphor of love, and lover for Sufis is very often the Prophet himself, right? And in Hindu bhakti, you find Radha Krishna as a trope of bhakti, but you also have a metaphor of Madhura bhakti. That is, very often the santas would assume the persona of gopi, gopi bhav, or it is called Madhura bhakti. That means you, the devotee, becomes gopi, and Krishna is the divine. So, so the erotic metaphor becomes a spiritual metaphor in many, and Jaidev's Geet Govind is again a very important one in that. So Madhura Bhakti is a very important thing, and closest or most extensive Madhura Bhakti you will find in Gujarati poet called Narsi Mehta, who almost rewrites Jaidev's Geet Govind into Gujarati. So Ugharo Shungar was the word used by certain critics, because you understand Narsi Mehta largely as a Gandhian poet, which he never was, right? So lot of explicit sexual eroticism you find in Narsi Mehta, and it is called Ugharo Shungar. So that's a good example of Madhura Bhakti. Anything that you want to suggest, say before we read one poem? We won't discuss this poem, we'll just read it. And so in this book, the Bija, the poem is given on page number 42. But I will read its Sadhukari version, right? And I'm going to share my screen for that. And it is from the book that I have given in the group. So I will just read it and we'll stop for today. We'll discuss it next time. So can you see my screen? ट्रांसलेशन इंग्लिश में देखना है तो आपके बुक में दिया है, यू कैन सी दैट, राइट? ओके, द फर्स्ट लाइन ऑफ दिस इज संतो देखत जग बोराना, and it is a refrain, right? It is repeated after every line. संतो देखत जग बोराना, साच कहो तो मारन दावे, झूठ जग पतियाना, नेमी देखा धर्मी देखा, प्रात करे स्नाना, आतम मारी पाषाण ही, तुझे उनमें किछुओ न ज्ञाना, बहुतक देखा पीर औलिया, पढ़े किताब कुराना. मुरीद तब तदबीर बतावे उनमें उहे जो ज्ञाना, आसन मारी डिंब दरी बैठे मन में बहुत गुमाना, संतो देखत जग बोराना, पीतर पाथर पूजन लागे तीरथ गर्भ भुलाना, टोपी पहरी माला पहरे छाप तिकलक अनुमाना, संतो देखत जग बोराना, साखी शब्दे गावत भूले आत्म खबरी न जाना, हिंदू कहे मोहि राम प्यारा तुर्क कहे रहीमाना, आपुस में दो लड़ी लड़ी मुए मरम न कहू जाना, घर घर मंत्र देत फिरत है महिमा के अभिमाना, संतो देखत जग बोराना, गुरु सहित शिष्य सब बूढ़े अंत काल पछताना, कहीं कबीर सुनो हो संतो ई सब भरम भुलाना, केतिक कहो कहाँ नहीं माने सहजे सहज समाना, संतो देखत जग बोराना. Translation on page 42. Right, and it goes something like this. Do you have this with you? Saints, I see the world is mad. If I tell the truth, they rush to beat me. If I lie, they trust me. I have seen pious Hindus rule followers, every morning bath takers. I have seen pious Hindus rule followers, kill early morning bath takers, killing souls. They worship rocks. They know nothing. I have seen plenty of Muslim teachers, holy men, reading their holy books and teaching their pupils techniques. They know just as much. And posturing yogis, hypocrites, hearts crammed with pride, praying to brass, to stones, reeling with pride in their pilgrimage, fixing their caps and their prayer beads, painting their brow marks and arm marks, braying their hymns, braying their hymns and their couplets, reeling. They never heard of soul. The Hindu says Ram is beloved, the Turk says Rahim, then they kill each other. No one knows the secret. They buzz their mantras from house to house, puff with pride. The pupils drown along with their gurus. In the end, they are sorry. Kabir says, listen, saints, they are all deluded. Whatever I say, nobody gets it. It is too simple. What do you think of this?